Okay, imagine this. A society where power and wealth aren't just concentrated, but like locked into this cycle. A cycle that keeps feeding itself, and it shapes everything. Our economy, yeah, but maybe even, surprisingly, our biology. Today, we're doing a deep dive into oligarchy. But, forget the political sound bites. This isn't about rhetoric. We're looking at this really groundbreaking AI-driven scientific analysis. It treats oligarchy almost like a complex adaptive system. So our mission for you listening in is to pull out the really vital insights from this huge report, help you grasp how power concentrates and, well, what its hidden impacts actually are.
Yeah, and what's really compelling is how this analysis pulls threads from, everywhere. Political science, philosophy, history, sociology, economics, law, even biology, as you said.
Wow.
And it builds this central argument. Oligarchy, fundamentally, it's a power system rooted in really extreme material inequality. And the key thing is, this inequality is, and this is a quote, unusually resistant to dispersion and equalization. That really sets the stage.
Okay, resistant to dispersion. Let's unpack that. Oligarchy. The word itself is ancient, right? Greek. Rule by the few.
Exactly.
And the classical philosophers, they gave us a starting point. Like Aristotle. He saw oligarchy as, what, a deviant form, a corrupt version of aristocracy.
Right. He classified governments based on who rules and why.
Yeah.
So monarchy or aristocracy, they could rule for the common good in his view. But oligarchy, that was the perversion. Rule by the rich purely for their own gain.
So it was the motive.
Yes, and the basis. He was super clear. Wherever men rule by reason of their wealth, that is an oligarchy, and he thought it was unstable inherently.
Then you've got Plato in the Republic. He took more of a psychological angle, right? Moral, even.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. He thought oligarchy grows from this, obsession with money, where wealth gets confused with virtue itself.
It's money is goodness.
Pretty much. And he warned this would create a city divided against itself, a city of the rich and a city of the poor, perpetually plotting against one another.
Which sounds familiar.
Doesn't it? His radical solution, in his ideal state, was just to cut the link completely. Philosopher Kings. No private property allowed. Period.
Wow. Okay, so those are the ancient roots, the moral critiques.
Yeah.
How does the modern analysis, the one we're diving into, build on that?
Well, those classical ideas still hit home, but modern political economy really zooms in on the primacy of material wealth. Scholars like Jeffrey Winters, they really lay this out. Their point is, massive personal wealth isn't just one type of power. It's unique. It's a uniquely potent political resource.
Okay, how so? Unique how?
Because unlike, say, a famous family name or religious authority, wealth is, well, fungible. You can turn it into almost anything else: influence, access, lobbying power. It's universally translatable into political clout. And crucially, back to that first point, it's unusually resistant to dispersion and equalization. Hard to break up, hard to spread around.
Got it. Fungible, resistant. So it's not just having power, it's the nature of wealth power.
Exactly. And this leads to thinking about oligarchy not just as a state of being, but as a continuous activity. The report calls it wealth defense.
Wealth defense.
Yeah. It's the main goal for people with huge material resources. Protect and grow their wealth. That drives their political actions. Lobbying for lower taxes, pushing for deregulation, funding think tanks that support their views, shaping how people think about wealth.
So wait, does that mean any rich CEO is an oligarch?
Not necessarily. The analysis makes a distinction. A corporate CEO is only really an oligarch if they personally command massive concentrations of material resources that can be deployed for political ends. It's about personal command over deployable wealth for politics.
Okay, that clarifies things. Wealth defense as ongoing political work.
Yeah.
So if that's the core focus, plutocracy, rule by wealth, are there other kinds of oligarchy the report touches on?
Yeah, it acknowledges them. While wealth-based is maybe the most common form we see today, the term can apply more broadly. You could talk about a clerical oligarchy, like in Iran, where religious leaders hold ultimate power. Or think about apartheid-era South Africa that was a racial minority oligarchy where one group monopolized political and economic control based on race.
Right. Different bases for the few who rule.
But what's really critical, especially for understanding modern Western nations like the U.S., is how oligarchy can operate through channels that are perfectly legal. Constitutionally protected, even.
That's a key tension.
Huge tension. Luke Winslow, a scholar mentioned in the report, points out that oligarchs often have no fear of legal consequences precisely because oligarchy itself is not against the law.
That's a stark thought.
Isn't it? Think about it. Lobbying, campaign finance, central tools for wealth defense. They're often framed under democratic rights, like the U.S. First Amendment right to petition the government. And then you have landmark court decisions, like Citizens United in the U.S., which basically interpreted the rules in a way that enhanced the ability to translate wealth into political influence.
So the fight isn't just about stopping illegal bribery. It's about the actual rules of the game.
Exactly. It's about confronting the fundamental rules of the democratic game itself. That's where the real struggle lies.
Okay, this is fascinating. But it sounds maybe like a modern problem, the legal stuff. Has oligarchy always been around? How's it shown up across history?
Oh, it's been around millennia. The report traces this. You see early forms in the ancient world. Ancient Greece, city-states like Sparta, Corinth, even Athens, before democracy really took hold. They had councils of aristocrats, wealthy landowners, like the Eupatridae in Athens, a hereditary elite. But these were often brittle, lots of popular uprising.
Right, unstable, like Aristotle said.
Yeah. Then the Roman Republic. It had democratic bits, sure, but the Senate, the noble patrician families, they held enormous sway. Fast forward to medieval Europe, power was concentrated in the landed nobility, the feudal system. That's a form of oligarchy. And the Italian merchant republics, Venice, Genoa. Run by councils of super wealthy merchants, the Medici family in Florence is like the classic case study, using vast wealth to basically run the show politically.
So it shifts farmland, trade wealth, but the pattern is there.
Exactly. And moving into the modern era, the source of wealth shifts again. From land to industry, then finance, now maybe information. The Industrial Revolution, the Gilded Age in the U.S. that created the robber barons, right? Rockefeller, Carnegie. Unprecedented industrial fortunes, massive political influence.
Which then led to backlash, like the Progressive Era.
Directly. A societal reaction. Now, jump to post-Soviet Russia. Textbook case of rapid oligarchy formation. Chaos of privatization, state assets basically grabbed by a small group of connected guys. Energy, metals, resources, and then they fuse that economic power with political power. Really close ties to the state, figures like Putin, a system where the state and these oligarchs are just deeply tangled up.
Intertwined.
Deeply. And you see a similar dynamic, though different flavor, in contemporary China. Economic liberalization created space for princelings, descendants of higher-ranking officials, and business tycoons. Their wealth and influence depend entirely on connections to the ruling party, to the state.
No, state connection is key in those models.
Very much so. Now, bring it home to the U.S. today. There's a lot of serious scholarship arguing the U.S. shows strong characteristics of a de facto oligarchy operating within a de jure democracy.
Meaning, in practice, it acts like one, even if the laws say democracy.
Precisely. The huge concentration of wealth has been empirically tied to concentrated political influence. There was that landmark 2014 study, Gillens and Page. They looked at almost 1,800 policy issues, and they found the preferences of economic elites lined up really strongly with what actually happened, policy-wise, while the preferences of the average American, quote, near zero, statistically non-significant impact.
Wow. Let that sink in. Near zero impact for the average person's preference on policy. That's stark.
It is. It's a quantitative look at what this de facto oligarchy can mean in practice.
So is this pattern, this tendency for oligarchy to pop up, is it just random bad luck? Or is there something deeper going on historically?
That's a great question. The report argues it's a persistent pattern. Oligarchic systems seem to consistently reemerge from the ashes of systemic change. It's not a fluke.
Okay, example.
Well, we mentioned the fall of the Soviet Union boom, Russian oligarchs. The end of colonialism in places like South Africa didn't lead to perfect equality. Often new forms of elite rule emerged. The Industrial Revolution created the industrial oligarchs. It suggests a principle. Big transitions, whether political or economic, create power vacuums. Opportunities arise to grab assets.
And whoever is best positioned, or maybe most ruthless.
Exactly. They seize control, could be state industries, land, new tech, patents, whatever. That becomes the new material base for their power. The form changes, landed gentry, industrialists, tech billionaires, but the process of consolidating power seems remarkably consistent.
And you mentioned the state connection being key in Russia and China. How does that compare to, say, the Gilded Age?
Good point. There's often a symbiotic relationship with the state in many modern oligarchies. They're not just influencing the state from outside, like maybe the robber barons tried to do. They're often enmeshed with it. The lines blur between public power and private wealth. It's a hybrid system. And the implication is pretty important. Trying to fix it by just targeting private wealth or just targeting political corruption might miss the mark. You might need to address the entire state-capital nexus.
Okay, we've seen how it appears, historically how it adapts. But the big question is, how does this power stick? Why is it so resilient, even in democracies? There must be some deep dynamics at play.
Absolutely. And that brings us to some really foundational sociological and psychological ideas. We can start with Robert Michaels. Back in 1911, he came up with his iron law of oligarchy.
The iron law. Sounds ominous.
It kind of is. He basically said all complex organizations will inevitably develop into oligarchies. His famous line, "Who says organization says oligarchy?"
Wow. Why? What's the mechanism?
He saw a few things working together. First, bureaucracy and specialization. In any big organization, you need leaders with specific knowledge, control over information. That creates an elite. Second, you have to delegate power. And this combines with what Michelle saw as apathy from the rank and file, even a psychological need to be led. People just check out. And third, once that leadership group is in place, they control resources. They tend to promote people loyal to them, so they self-perpetuate.
Bureaucracy, apathy, self-perpetuation. That's the iron law.
That's the core of it. And it fits into broader elite theory from thinkers like Pareto and Mosca, this idea that society is always divided to a ruling minority and a ruled majority. In the U.S. context, C. Wright Mills talked about the power elite, top dogs in economics, politics, the military, interconnected. And they stay on top partly through controlling institutions, but also through what sociologists call homosocial reproduction.
Meaning?
Elites tend to promote other people who are, well, like them. Same background, same values, same school sometimes. It keeps the circle closed.
Okay, so there are structures, organizational dynamics. What about the psychology of it? How is consent or maybe apathy maintained?
Right. It's not just structure. Modern oligarchies, especially in democracies, rely less on brute force and more on sophisticated tools of ideological and legal manipulation. Remember Luke Winslow, he noted this subtlety. It's about enticing rather than commanding citizens and maintaining what seems like an absence from political authority, making it feel like it's not really there.
How do they do that?
A key concept is manufacturing consent, funding think tanks to produce favorable research, controlling media outlets or influencing them through advertising, shaping public narratives, often promoting an ideology that basically says extreme wealth equals merit, competence, fitness to govern, equating riches with being smart and capable.
The meritocracy idea pushed to an extreme.
Exactly. And this creates a kind of psychological feedback loop. People see the system as complex, maybe feel powerless. That leads to apathy, which, ironically, then lets the elite consolidate power further, seeming to prove the iron law was right all along. Michaels himself said rank-and-file apathy was key to leadership basically getting away with things.
So our own feelings of powerlessness can actually reinforce the system.
It's a tricky loop. And of course, in more authoritarian places, the psychological tools get much harsher. Think Orwell's 1984, changing history, controlling language, newspeak, making people hold contradictory beliefs, doublethink, all tools to control thought itself.
This is deep. Okay, so structures, psychology. But the report goes even further, right? Into the systemic impact, beyond just politics and economics, even into biology. That sounds wild.
It does sound wild, but the connections are surprisingly direct when you look at the research. Let's start with the political economy of concentrated wealth. Formal economic models, like one by Darren Acemoglu cited in the report, show this trade-off. Oligarchies are good at protecting the property of the existing elite, but they tend to put up significant entry barriers for new entrepreneurs, new competition.
Why would they do that? Seems counterproductive for the economy overall.
Well, from their perspective, it's about factor price manipulation. Basically, if you limit new companies, you limit the demand for workers. That helps keep wages down, maximizing profits for the existing oligarchs.
Suppressing wages by limiting competition.
Exactly. So the crucial insight here is that oligarchy's main problem isn't short-term inefficiency, it's dynamic inefficiency. It becomes rigid. It stops innovating because it's blocking new ideas and players. So it might look stable, but over the long run, it stagnates. It falls behind more dynamic, open societies. It's not just unfair, it's ultimately inefficient and unsustainable.
Okay, inefficient long-term. What about the sheer concentration of wealth itself? Does math tell us anything?
Yeah, it's fascinating. Wealth concentration often follows mathematical patterns. You've probably heard of the Pareto distribution, the 80-20 rule.
Right.
In wealth, it's often way more extreme, like the top 1% holding 40% or more. It looks like a power law or a fractal pattern. And models show this kind of distribution can actually emerge naturally from systems with exponential growth, like compound interest.
So it's not necessarily some grand conspiracy. It can just happen?
It's a tendency. We measure it with things like the Gini coefficient. 0 is perfect equality, 1 is total inequality. Oligarchic societies have high Gini scores. And what's really interesting is agent-based models. Even simple simulations where, say, wealth tends to flow from poorer to richer actors, they consistently show wealth getting highly concentrated over time.
So the models suggest extreme inequality is almost like a default setting.
That's a key takeaway. It implies that extreme inequality might be a baseline tendency of complex economic systems, which means you need continuous, active political and institutional intervention to counteract it. It doesn't just sort itself out.
And does real-world data back this up?
Absolutely. You mentioned the NBER data for the U.S. top 1% wealth share climbing from maybe 25–30% in the 80s up to 35–40% more recently. That's a massive concentration trend, consistent with these models.
Okay, so economic stagnation, massive concentration. Now, the biology part. How does a political system affect our health?
This is where it gets really profound. The report calls it the biological cost, health, stress, and the epigenetics of inequality. The core idea links back to inequality. Oligarchic systems create high inequality, and study after study shows high inequality societies have worse health outcomes overall. Lower life expectancy, higher infant mortality, more mental illness, and this is true even when you control for individual income. A poor person in a more equal society might be healthier than a middle-income person in a very unequal one.
Wait, so it's not just about being poor, it's about living in an unequal system. How does that work?
The main mechanism seems to be psychosocial. Living in a very steep social hierarchy creates chronic stress. Think status anxiety, insecurity, lack of social cohesion. This constant background stress has direct negative physiological consequences. The report even suggests analyzing oligarchy itself as a kind of pathogenic agent, something that causes disease.
Wow, pathogenic agent. So how does stress literally change our biology?
That's where epigenetics comes in. It's the science of how our environment can change how our genes work without changing the DNA sequence itself. Think of epigenetic markers like methylation as little switches on the DNA. They turn genes up or down.
Right.
And chronic stress, especially early in life, is a huge driver of these epigenetic changes. It leaves a biological residue. For example, research links low socioeconomic status to changes in genes that regulate our stress response, leading to high cortisol, or changes affecting brain regions involved in mood, increasing depression risk. It literally gets under the skin.
So social conditions are writing instructions onto our genes.
In a way, yes, altering their expression. But here's maybe the most startling part. The intergenerational transmission of disadvantage. Some studies suggest these epigenetic changes might even be heritable, passed down.
You mean the biological effects of stress could be passed to your kids?
The evidence is still developing, but research, like on descendants of Holocaust survivors, points in that direction. Severe stress impacts might transmit biologically, maybe via the germline.
That is incredibly profound.
Yeah.
It means social disadvantage could become biological disadvantage, passed down, creating a vicious cycle.
Exactly. It shifts the conversation about social mobility. It's not just sociology anymore. It's fundamentally biosocial.
Okay, this oligarchy thing is clearly not just about politics. It's economic, it's psychological, it's even biological. Where does the law fit back into this? You mentioned legal channels being used earlier.
Right. The legal system is a key battleground. And the report highlights this idea of a lost tradition in U.S. constitutional thinking, which is really interesting. Legal scholars Fishkin and Forbath talk about the anti-oligarchy constitution. Their argument is that preventing oligarchy was actually a central goal for the U.S. founders and later reformers.
Really? Not just democracy, but anti-oligarchy specifically.
That's their reading. People like the Jacksonians, the progressives, the New Dealers, they believe the Constitution required actively dispersing power and opportunity, maintaining a strong middle class. They saw concentrated power, especially moneyed power, as a two-pronged constitutional threat. It undermined political equality, creating a kind of aristocracy, and it undermined fair economic opportunity.
And this view justify
Reforms. Antitrust laws to break up monopolies, laws protecting unions to give workers power, even the federal income tax via the 16th Amendment, all seen as tools to prevent oligarchic concentration.
So that was the tradition. What happened? What are the legal levers today, and why do they seem less effective sometimes?
Well, campaign finance reform is the obvious one, trying to limit money in politics, maybe public financing. But it faces huge hurdles. The Supreme Court, especially in cases like Buckley v. Vallejo and Citizens United, has made it really difficult, equating money with speech, basically saying you can't limit spending just to reduce inequality.
The money is speech doctrine.
Right. Plus, money is like water. It finds a way. Restrict direct contributions, it flows into lobbying or dark money groups where you don't know the source. It's slippery.
Okay, what about antitrust? Breaking up big companies.
Historically, that was a key anti-oligarchy tool. But for several decades now, its focus got narrowed way down, mostly just to consumer welfare, meaning short-term prices. There's a big debate now about whether antitrust can or should be used again more broadly to tackle wealth inequality itself, not just prices.
So the legal fight is really about how we interpret the Constitution.
Fundamentally, yes. It's a battle between the anti-oligarchy tradition and the current interpretation that tends to prioritize more formal ideas of free speech and property rights, even if it allows massive power imbalances. And this leads to what the report calls the policy whack-a-mole problem.
Whack-a-mole.
Yeah. You focus on restricting campaign donations. Okay, the money floods into lobbying. You try to regulate lobbying. It goes into funding think tanks or media campaigns. Power just shifts. It means a successful strategy probably can't just hit one thing. It must be systemic and multi-pronged.
Systemic, multi-pronged. Okay. This connects to something else. Oligarchy isn't just structures and laws, it's values, right?
Yeah.
It must shape how people think, both the rulers and the ruled.
Absolutely. The report delves into the moral psychology of wealth and power, focusing first on the elite. And the findings are, well, pretty sobering. Research suggests wealth often correlates inversely with empathy. Some studies show lower-income individuals are actually better at reading emotions and faces.
Seriously. More wealth, less empathy.
The data points that way. Other studies found, like, luxury car drivers were less likely to yield to pedestrians. Just thinking about money made people more likely to lie or act selfishly in experiments. Power itself seems to diminish empathy, leading people to objectify others more.
That's disturbing. Man.
The cognitive biases play a big role. Self-serving bias, attributing success solely to yourself, resisting redistribution. The just world illusion, believing the world is fair, so victims must deserve their fate. An elitism bias, thinking your own group's views are inherently superior. And some even argue the relentless pursuit of more wealth can act like an addiction, driven by constantly comparing yourself to others, fear of losing status. It can really distort values.
Wow. Less empathy, cognitive biases, maybe even addiction.
Yeah, the report suggests this combination creates a morally corrosive feedback loop. It makes oligarchy not just resilient, but potentially morally damaging for those within it.
So if that's the psychology of the elite, what are the ethical problems for the whole system?
Well, the most obvious is systemic corruption and injustice, prioritizing private gain over public good. Maybe even a two-tiered justice system where the wealthy play by different rules. Then there's the erosion of democratic values. It fundamentally violates political equality, the idea of one person, one vote having real meaning. It erodes public trust. And crucially, there's the environmental impact.
How does oligarchy connect to environmental damage?
The drive for profit maximization, especially with externalized costs, incentivizes extractive industries, pollution, and blocking climate action that might hurt short-term profits. The report cites the vastly disproportionate carbon footprint of the ultra-rich. One study estimated the richest 1% have emissions that cancel out the savings from nearly 1 million wind turbines.
1 million wind turbines, negated by the lifestyle of the 1%? That's staggering. It makes oligarchy an ecological issue, too.
Absolutely. It elevates it beyond just politics or economics. Now, how does the public come to accept this? It's not automatic. It involves cultural hegemony and the normalization of inequality.
Hegemony, meaning dominance of ideas.
Exactly. It's maintained through a continuous and well-funded campaign of cultural production, controlling information via media ownership or advertising influence, shaping narratives, polarizing people to distract them. Think tanks play a role, producing expert reports that give an intellectual veneer to policies benefiting the wealthy. Remember rebranding the estate tax as the death tax? That's a classic example.
Shaping the language.
And promoting an elite ideology, portraying billionaires not just as successful, but as almost transcendent figures, uniquely qualified to lead or solve problems, legitimizing their power.
So how does the average person react? Why the acquiescence?
Several psychological factors. The myth of meritocracy is powerful. The belief that anyone can make it, so extreme wealth must be deserved, makes inequality seem fair. Then there's alienation and passivity, feeling overwhelmed, relying on sound bites, maybe losing the capacity for critical thinking that Mill's worried about, that need to be led, Michael's mentioned. And a really effective tactic, divide and conquer. using nationalism, racism, cultural grievances, whatever works, to pit different groups against each other, diverts anger away from the underlying structural inequalities.
That sounds familiar. It's just a connection between oligarchy and some forms of populism.
Yes, the report points to a dangerous symbiosis between oligarchy and a certain brand of populist authoritarianism. Populist leaders might tap into genuine public anger, but then redirect it towards scapegoats, immigrants, cultural elites, whoever. And often these same populist leaders are quietly funded by oligarchs who benefit from the policies like tax cuts or deregulation that get enacted once the populists gain power. It's a strategic deflection.
Wow. Okay, we've covered history, mechanisms, impacts, morality, culture. What about the future? The report looks ahead, right? At how new technologies might change the game.
It does, and this part is frankly quite alarming. Emerging frontiers, AI, biotechnology, and the next generation of oligarchy. We're already seeing a new tech oligarchy rise, where data is the new oil. AI, especially the big models, needs massive computing power and data sets. That naturally concentrates power in a few giant companies and the people who control them.
So AI itself could become a tool for concentration.
Potentially leading to an AI-enabled oligarchy, power held by a few humans, or maybe even eventually by autonomous AI systems managing society. And AI systems have advantages over human rulers. They do not age, die, or suffer from the same frailties. That makes the idea of democratizing AI, ensuring broad access and control, incredibly urgent.
Okay, that's AI. What about biotechnology?
This raises the specter of biological stratification. Think gene editing tools like CRISPR. They could potentially be used to enhance human abilities, intelligence, physical prowess, disease resistance.
Designer babies, that kind of thing.
Potentially. Now, if those enhancements are only available to the super rich, you could create a de facto biological caste system, a literal genetic divide between the enhanced elite and everyone else. How could you even compete?
That's chilling.
And then there's radical life extension, longevity escape velocity. If therapies emerge that let the wealthy live for centuries while everyone else has a normal lifespan, that's the ultimate form of inequality. Power could be consolidated across generations, literally centuries. These aren't just sci-fi scenarios anymore. They pose fundamental challenges to our ideas of human rights and equality.
And the report suggests these two trends, AI and biotech, could combine.
Yes, the fusion of these two technological frontiers is the really frightening prospect. Imagine a permanent hereditary oligarchy based on controlling the human biological code itself, reinforced by AI surveillance and social control. That's a shift from power based on what you own to power based on what you are biologically, a far more fundamental and potentially irreversible form of stratification.
It's really striking how often we hear that this tech trajectory is just inevitable. But the report suggests that narrative itself serves an ideological purpose, right? It stops us asking about power and control.
Exactly. It presents political choices as mere technological destiny. So, with all these challenges, historical patterns, legal loopholes, psychological loops, future tech threats, what can actually be done? How do we mitigate this?
Is there any hope?
Well, the report doesn't offer easy answers, but it does lay out a data-driven framework for promoting equitable governance. The first point is key. It's a complex systemic problem, so it needs a systemic, multi-pronged response. No single silver bullet fix. The overall goal has to be shifting real political power away from concentrated wealth and toward organized citizens.
Okay, so what are some of those prongs? What interventions does the evidence suggest?
It covers several areas. In electoral and political reform, things like proportional representation voting systems tend to lead to more redistributive outcomes because they translate votes into seats more fairly. Public financing of elections helps reduce reliance on rich donors. Fiscal policy, progressive wealth taxes, inheritance taxes, they directly target the stock of concentrated wealth, not just income, and can fund public goods. Market regulation, stronger antitrust enforcement to break up monopolies, strengthening labor laws and unions to create countervailing power against capital.
Makes sense. What else?
Institutional innovation. Things like citizens' assemblies using randomly selected citizens to deliberate on policy, potentially bypassing captured legislatures, more decentralization, building power at the community level. And finally, future-proofing governance, actively thinking about democratic control over AI development and deployment, seriously regulating human enhancement technologies, maybe even banning non-therapeutic uses if they risk creating that biological caste system.
So a whole suite of potential tools, but needing to be applied systemically.
Exactly. No illusions that it's easy, but emphasizing that inaction allows these concentration dynamics to just continue, potentially amplified by new tech.
Okay, so Wrapping this deep dive up, the report paints a picture of oligarchy as this complex, adaptive system, driven fundamentally by wealth defense, with really profound negative impacts on the economy's dynamism, on democracy's fairness, on our health, even down to our biology, and on the environment itself.
Yeah, and it really underscores that pushing back requires an equally sophisticated systems-based response, reducing the massive concentrations of wealth, yes, but also dispersing political power more broadly and actively building up the power of organized citizens as a counterweight.
So here's a final thought for you, our listener, to mull over. The report shows that big moments of change, revolutions, new technologies often create openings for oligarchy to reemerge, maybe even stronger. If that's true, what does it mean for how we navigate the huge transformations we're facing right now, like climate change or the AI revolution? What stands out to you as the most crucial thing we need to focus on to safeguard shared power, to prevent even more extreme concentration in the future? Something to think about.
This is DigitView.